The wire feeder under the apple tree was still swinging a little in the morning breeze, and the shells at the bottom were untouched. That was the strange part. The hawfinch had been there yesterday, and the day before that, cracking hard little kernels with that heavy, patient bill. Then, almost overnight, the feeder fell quiet. At first, you look for the easy answers. A cat in the hedge, a change in weather. Maybe the bird simply found a better patch of trees somewhere else. And sure, any of those can happen. But when the same bird is still around the garden edge, still visiting the old branches, still not coming down to eat, you start to wonder what it knows that you don't. Because the hawfinch is not a casual feeder. It specializes in hard, oil-rich kernels, the kind hidden inside hornbeam, beech mast, cherry stones, and plum stones. And that matters, because those are exactly the foods whose fats start to fail fastest when summer heat hangs in place. Once the air stays above about 27 degrees Celsius, or 80 Fahrenheit, the seed stops being stored and starts becoming something else. You may not see it yet, you may not smell it yet, but the bird can. If this kind of backyard mystery pulls you in, subscribe and stay with me. And that something else begins with a fact most people never get told when they buy a feeder. The hard seeds this bird loves are not dead pellets. They are living tissue, packed with oils, with tiny reserves meant to feed a future plant. When warm air sits over them day after day, those oils start to react with oxygen, just a slow chemical slide. The glossy kernel is still there. The pale shell still looks dry, but inside, the fats have started to break apart. For a bird built to handle cherry stones and beech mast, that matters more than it would for a casual peck at softer food. Those dense kernels hold rich energy, and rich energy spoils faster in heat. Leave that food in a feeder through several hot afternoons, and what should smell faintly nutty and clean begins to flatten out. Then it turns. Not rotten in the way people imagine. No obvious slime, no black stain, no waving red flag. Just seed that has quietly turned rancid. And here is the trouble. Your nose is a poor judge of that change. You might lift the lid, catch only warm dust and dry husk, and think everything is fine. The bird lands once, shifts its weight, tests a single piece, and leaves. The chemistry did. The next problem is worse, and it starts where heat meets moisture. That is where a summer feeder becomes more than stale. The bird's food does not sit in clean, dry air. It sits in a little chamber that traps humidity from dawn dew, from a brief shower, from the moisture already inside the seed, and from the warm stillness under a lid. Put that together with heat, and the inside of the feeder turns into a pocket of damp shade. For a hawfinch, reaching into that space for dense seed can mean touching food that has been changing in two ways at once. First, the oils break down. Then, if the air stays muggy, mold begins to find a foothold. One of the names that comes up again and again in spoiled bird food is aspergillus. You do not need to remember the name, only what it means. This growth can produce aflatoxins, natural poisons that attack the liver. A bird does not need a dramatic, filthy feeder for that risk to exist. A few clumped kernels, a seam that stays wet, a shaded corner where air does not move. That can be enough. And for a specialist that bites through hard seed with force, the danger is not only on the surface. It can be in the food itself. Here's the part that unsettles people most. You may tip the feeder in your hand, hear the dry rattle, see nothing fuzzy, nothing green, nothing that looks ruined. Meanwhile, the bird approaches, pauses, and refuses it for a reason you still cannot see. Because seeing is not the sense it trusts first. And that is the point where your senses and the birds begin to part company. You and I are clumsy with this kind of warning. We trust sight first. If the feeder looks tidy, if the seed still pours with a dry little hiss, if nothing smells obviously sour when the lid comes off, we assume the food is safe enough. But the hawfinch does not need a visible mess. It works on a finer scale than that, especially with the kind of rich seed it is drawn to in summer. What recent research keeps pointing toward is simple, even if the mechanism is not. Many songbirds can pick up the faint chemical traces of spoilage long before a person can. The earliest change in the air above the food, the first hint that the oils have shifted or that mold has begun its work. The spoilage odor they detect may sit far below your threshold, but not below theirs. So, when that thick-beaked bird drops onto the feeder ring, there is a whole layer of information arriving before the first bite. Metal warmed by the sun, dust on the shell, the breath of seed in a closed space. It leans in, tests the air, and makes a decision that can look almost rude from the window, though it is anything but. This is why a garden can feel confusing in midsummer. The same hawfinch may still visit the branch above the feeder, still scan the ground beneath it, still be fully part of your yard, and still refuse the food. Watch closely, because the pattern of that refusal tells you when the problem began. If you pay attention to that refusal, it rarely happens as a clean disappearance. A bird like this usually gives you a sequence first. It comes in fast, lands with that solid little thump on the perch, takes one kernel, then drops away sooner than usual. The next visit is later, then briefer. Then there is a morning when the shells in the tray do not move at all, and the only sound is the feeder tapping softly against its hook. By the time the feeder fell quiet, the warning had been there for days. That is why the usual explanations feel so tempting. It is easier to blame a shadow overhead, a neighborhood disturbance, a change in the season. Those things let the problem stay outside your hands. But when the same bird is still using the nearby cover, still watching the feeding spot, still staying in range without trusting the food, the harder answer begins to come into focus. It is not rejecting your garden. It is rejecting a very specific condition inside one container in that garden. And once you see it that way, something important shifts. The thick bill, the careful pause, the quick withdrawal, all of it stops looking random. The hawfinch is not being moody. It is reading the food with a level of caution you would probably want for yourself if your own meals came without labels, dates, or refrigeration. So the question changes. It is no longer, why did the bird leave? It becomes, what do you change first so it can trust this place again? The first thing you change is the clock. In cool weather, people get away with a lazy rhythm. In summer, a bird that depends on rich kernels cannot. If those seeds are sitting through hot afternoons and damp nights, you need to treat the feeder as short-term storage, not a bin you top off and forget. For oily food, every 3 to 5 days is the safer rhythm. On the calendar. That sounds demanding until you shrink the job. A smaller feeder helps the hawfinch more than a grand full one in July. Less seed sits around long enough to go stale. Less moisture stays trapped in corners. Less of that heavy, warm smell builds under the lid. You are not trying to impress the bird with abundance. You are trying to offer something clean enough, often enough, that it does not have time to fail. And yes, this is the part many people resist, because a half-filled feeder can feel stingy. It is not. For a bird testing dense food with care, fresh beats plentiful every time. A modest handful of sound kernels is better than a full chamber of seed that may already be on its way to trouble. The hawfinch does not measure generosity by volume. It measures trust by condition. But timing alone is only half the repair. Because if you clean on schedule and then put fresh seed back into a feeder that still smells faintly of old residue, the bird can tell before you ever see the mistake. So the repair starts to work only when the feeder itself stops carrying yesterday into today. That means washing away the old film, the dust in the seams, the damp corners that hold on after a hot afternoon. A quick rinse is not the same thing. You want the surfaces that touch seed to be clean enough that nothing stale is left for the new batch to sit against. The hawfinch may never tell you this in so many words, of course, but it does tell you with its feet. It lands sooner, it stays longer, it comes back the next morning without that careful hesitation. And there is a nice, plain lesson in that. Freshness is not a feeling, it is a condition. A feeder can look neat from 10 feet away and still smell wrong up close, still hold a trace of old oils, still carry the kind of residue that makes oil-rich kernels turn rancid all over again. You do not need to make it sterile. You just need to stop giving spoilage a place to restart. Once you do that, the bird begins to test the space differently. A visit is no longer a brief inspection. It becomes a feeding, then two, then a pattern. But there is one more detail that people often miss, and it is the one that decides whether the hawfinch fully trusts the spot again. The feeder's place in the light. That last piece is where a lot of good feeder work falls apart. You can clean well, refresh often, and still lose the hawfinch if the feeder sits in full heat through the hardest part of the afternoon. Sunlight does two things at once. It warms the seed and it warms the little space around it, so the air inside holds more stress than the yard does. That is where oils age faster and where damp corners dry unevenly, then hold on just long enough for trouble to start again. So the best place is not the brightest place. It is the gentler one. Morning light is fine. Afternoon shade is better. Under a tree edge, beside a wall that breaks the worst glare, or anywhere the feeder can stay cool enough that the kernels do not sit in a hot pocket all day. That changes the whole equation. The bird is still near. It is still watching. But now the food arrives in a condition it can accept. And once you move it, don't expect a grand announcement. The same hawfinch that ignored the old spot may come in cautiously at first. Just one visit, one sample, one look around. That is enough. It is checking whether the place has become reliable again, and it will tell you the answer long before you can smell anything yourself. Because the shade matters more than it looks from the window. And there is one kind of food that still needs a little extra care before we finish this. There is one last kind of food that asks for more caution when the weather turns hard on it. Anything rich and soft, especially suet or peanut-based mixes, ages fast in heat. A hawfinch may not be built around those foods the way it is around hard kernels, but if you offer them in summer, they have the same problem in a different form. They go off quickly, and they can carry a spoilage odor they detect long before you do. The surface may still look smooth. The scent may still seem faint to you. To the bird, the signal is already there. So in the hottest weeks, many people simply pull those foods back or give them only in deep shade and in very small amounts. Not because the bird is fragile, but because the food is. That is the part worth remembering. The safer feeder is not the fullest one. It is the one that stays fresh enough to earn another visit. And when you put all of this together, the pattern gets simple. Clean it often, dry it well, keep the portions small, keep the feeder out of the worst heat. Offer what this bird can trust, not what looks generous from a distance. If you get that part right, the hawfinch does something very quiet and very clear. It starts to come back. And then, one warm morning, the proof is not dramatic at all. The feeder hangs in its shadier place, metal cool enough to touch, the seed level lower because you stopped filling it like a storage jar and started treating it like fresh food. The lid is dry. The tray is clean. A breeze moves through, carrying leaf smell instead of that old, closed-up heat. And into that calmer space comes the same thick-headed bird, dropping from the branch above with none of the old stop-and-go caution. It lands to feed. It braces, takes a kernel, works it in that powerful bill, and stays. Then another. A pale chip of shell flicks down and taps the stone underneath. That tiny sound is the whole answer. Just a living creature finding the food acceptable again. That is the real gift of doing this right. You are not persuading the bird. You are removing the reason it had to refuse you. Once the feeder is clean, cool, and lightly stocked, trust returns in the plainest way possible, by use. By evening, a scatter of fresh shell pieces has gathered below, bright against the darker ground. The feeder is quieter than a crowd, but no longer empty, and the branch above it no longer feels like a waiting room. If this changed the way you look at summer feeding, subscribe and keep this channel close. And if you've ever won a bird back by changing the feeder instead of blaming the season, I'd love to hear what happened.